Hello, everybody. My name's Miles Carlsten. I'm here from Princeton University to tell you guys about some of the new research that we've been doing with regards to the changes in miner incentives in the face of a diminishing block minting reward. During my talk, I'm first going to demonstrate that miners are actually going to be incentivized to not mine for some fraction of the time while they're solving the cryptographic hash puzzle for their blocks. I'm then going to talk about the future of miners purchasing miner hardware. And then I'm going to move into talking about the impact that this is going to have on the Bitcoin system and what's going to happen. And I'm going to present some results of simulations that we've created. Finally, I'm going to talk about the impact that this has on the Bitcoin community and what this means for the discussions that the Bitcoin community needs to have. So I'm going to start this talk with the block reward. So the block reward is the combination of a minting reward and transaction fees that a miner can stick into their block. So the idea has always been that as the minting reward goes down, the transaction fees will increase over time and kind of, keep the miners earning about the same amount of money. Even if this works, even if the miners are able to earn as much from their transaction fees as they were from the minting reward, are these two really equivalent? And the answer is, not necessarily, because the transaction fees have an interesting feature that they can be time dependent in the sense that a miner can only claim transaction fees as the transactions are added to their block. This means that as the transaction fees start to dominate the block reward more and more than the minting fee, the block reward itself becomes sort of time dependent. That's what we're interested in here. We're modeling the block reward as this linear function of time. We've got this factor b, which could be the initial minting reward, but it's just what the block is worth at time 0. And then we've got some scaling factor, some a of t, that the block increases in value with time. So something that can be added to this plot is that miners have like a set expense to mine a block. If a block is not worth a certain amount, it's not worth the electricity for the miner to mine that block. If we look at this threshold, above the threshold is worth a miner's time to mine the block, but below this threshold, it's not actually worth the miner's time to mine a block. Now, if we consider this red plot of what the block is worth over multiple blocks, you'll see something kind of interesting. There are these periods that it's worth a miner's time to mine, and there are these periods where it's not. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be referring to these times where it's not worth a miner's time to mine as the mining gaps. Okay, so I'm going to take a break from the mining gaps and talk about the future of hardware. So mining hardware is becoming more and more commoditized. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the efficiency of mining hardware isn't changing very much. In addition to that, mining hardware is becoming cheaper and cheaper. Moore's law is not in effect here when it comes to the mining hardware efficiency. And the cheaper, longer lasting miner hardware will mean that it's more available to everyone, and that's going to have effects with regard to the block size, and I'll tie these ideas together in just a moment. This is a plot that we've taken data from the Bitcoin Wiki mining hardware comparison page. And what you see here is you see the 5 most efficient machines cited on the page for a variety of different dates. And we've selected the 5 most efficient machines because and it says this clearly on the page that some of the mining hardware companies fudge their numbers a little bit to kind of take advantage of miners. But what you see here is kind of interesting. It's definitely very much a step function, which actually makes a lot of sense. When you consider that the mining hardware initially started graphics cards and then went to FPGAs and then transitioned into ASICs. What's also interesting about this plot is that if you look within a single generation of hardware, particularly if you look within ASICs, the efficiency hasn't changed much. Like this plot shows very clearly that over the last 18 months, there hasn't been much of an efficiency change in the mining hardware in the form of ASICs. In addition to that, what we see is that the price of ASICs have actually been going down when you measure it in the dollar cost for a machine for the number of gigahashes per second the machine can compute. So what's important between these two ideas is that the efficiency isn't changing, so mining hardware isn't being outdated. Your machine isn't being made obsolete. It's not that your machine is no longer going to be effective at computing hashes. It's going to cost too much. And in addition, it's going to be easier for people to acquire reasonable amounts of hash power because the cost of this hash power is going down. So what does this mean? Can we attach numbers to this gap? This starts with how the gap is calculated. So all miners will independently make this decision about when they decide to start mining. And they're going to be making this decision on an instantaneous basis. Essentially, this decision breaks down to whether or not the cost in electricity of computing a hash is less than the expected reward for each hash that they compute. So we have created a mathematical framework, which we are continuing to develop, that describes when exactly it's optimal for these miners to start mining. As a proof of concept, we also have simulations that show that this is indeed an ideal time for the miners to start mining. In this simulation, we try to model the Bitcoin network as accurately as we can using parameters that are found in the Bitcoin network today. The only thing that we do is we change the block reward by decreasing it and increase the amount of money that the amount of profits that miners are making from the transaction fees. Using these parameters, our mathematical model predicts an ideal gap of about 170 seconds. So in this simulation, we have the majority of miners mining at this ideal gap. And what we show is that if any miner tries to leave this ideal gap and starts mining earlier or starts mining later, their profits actually go down. So what does this mean for the future? Can we predict when the gap is going to occur, what the gap is going to look like as time goes on, things of this kind of nature? Well, if we make the economic argument that miners take their profits and invest it back into the market in the form of buying new mining hardware, we can. We can model what's going to happen to the gap, and we can model the behavior of the gap in the future. In this simulation, we have time on the x-axis, and we have the predicted ideal gap on the y-axis. And to kind of orient you, we have the x-axis labeled by block number, and we're about here. We're at block 370,000. So what this predicts is that, and this uses the same model for the Bitcoin system, trying to keep it as realistic as possible. In this one, we've got the actual block minting reward, and we make the assumption that A will, as the minting reward is diminished, what is cut out of the minting reward will be rolled into the transaction fees. And actually, we found that our exact description of what happens to A is actually not super relevant. We see very similar effects regardless. But back to the plot. So what you see here is that at the next block halving, it'll actually be ideal for miners to mine with a gap. And in addition, as miners invest their money back into the system, it's going to make the ideal gap actually increase. Now, I was talking about the commoditization of hardware earlier, and this is where that comes into play. This curve actually gets worse as hardware becomes commoditized. As miners are able to buy more hardware for less, and as their hardware doesn't essentially become obsolete, this curve becomes more steep, and the rate at which this ideal gap approaches 600 seconds becomes much more quick. So what is the takeaway of this prediction? Well, an important one is that we think that a gap will actually be profitable at the next block halving. Additionally, we think that long in the future, this gap actually approaches 600 seconds. And then as a final point, this issue is made worse by the fact that hardware is becoming commoditized. So this has obvious security implications. This increases the vulnerability to attack. And the reason that it increases the vulnerability to attack is if an adversary is willing to mine suboptimally, start mining right away, they're able to increase their perceived hash power in the network. So in this simulation, we have the majority of miners mining at some gap, and we show that if an attacker starts mining right away, what fraction of the overall hash rate they need in order to mine half the blocks, what fraction of the real hash rate they need in order to essentially perform a 51% attack. And as you can see, as the gap deviates from 0, the fraction of hash power that an attacker needs quickly drops from 50%. So this is a real issue and a real threat to the security of Bitcoin. So what does this mean? Well, it means that a block really needs to be immediately profitable to mine. An assumption that was made by this model is that there's no backlog of transactions. But that's a tricky issue in itself, because the backlog of transactions that would be needed to solve this issue, the backlog would need to constantly have enough value in it that a block is always immediately profitable to mine. And this has all sorts of negative side effects, because, the most obvious of which is that users are going to have to wait potentially long periods of time to get their transactions into the blockchain. At Princeton, we're researching lots of different aspects of Bitcoin, and we just released a Bitcoin MOOC on Coursera. And the exact description of this backlog is something that we're also trying to explore with future work. What I hope you get out of this presentation is that this mining gap is a real issue that needs to be part of the discussion when it comes to scaling Bitcoin. In particular, it's a very important issue when it comes to considering the change in the block size. Thank you, and I'm not actually answering questions now, but if you find me at lunch, I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions.
Awesome, thank you.